Welcome to the History Nerds United podcast. I'm your head nerd, Brendan. Thank you so much for being here. Today we have author Keith O'Brien and his book Charlie Hustle about the life of Pete Rose. Listen, if you're about to say, oh, I don't like baseball, I'm out of here. It's about more than baseball. It's about this person who, as we talk about, is very complex, in a lot of ways very unlikable. And a lot of the things that he dealt with, well, I was going to do this whole speech about history and all of that stuff, but guess what? Opening day is upon us, and there was already a gambling scandal for this season that just came out. Ohtani, huge baseball player if you don't know. He does a lot of really amazing things. He pitches, he hits. Anyway, gambling thing just came out about his translator, and everyone's going nuts. Everyone's starting to dig in. Perfect timing for a book about Pete Rose, who was kicked out of baseball permanently for gambling. So let's get to Keith so he can tell us all about it. And here we are with author Keith O'Brien, Charlie Hustle, The Rise and Fall of Pete Rose, and the Last Glory Days of Baseball. Keith, thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me, Brendan.
Keith, first question I was going to ask is what made you write this book? But looking in your bio, you grew up in and around Cincinnati. So I guess the question is, what took you so long to write this book?
Yeah, great question. You know, it's funny you mentioned, my childhood in Cincinnati. I'm going to date myself here for your listeners. I was born in the 1970s. I was too young to remember the Big Red Machine years, but I was in the wheelhouse of my boyhood love for baseball when Pete was traded back to the Reds in 1984. I certainly remember him breaking Ty Cobb's hit record in 1985. And I was, a fully cognizant and thinking teenager in 1989 when he was banned from baseball forever. His story in Cincinnati was really woven into the fabric of the city in those years. And I would argue really woven into the fabric of our nation. And so, yeah, it was always in the background for me. It was always there. But that in and of itself, isn't enough to pursue a book. Really what drew me to it was the fact that this seems like a time for reckoning, a time for reckoning for Pete, a time maybe for reckoning for us all. He's going to be 83 years old this April. And, as I like to say, we're all day to day. I wanted to try to revisit this story one more time while the people who lived it, Pete and those around him, were still here to give their voice to it. And then, of course, there's just this massive sea change in the world that has happened in the 35 years since Pete was banned. Everybody knows, gambling, sports gambling and others is now legal in most states. In many states, you can do it on your phone from the cheap seats at the stadium or from your couch. So what better time to revisit the story of one of our most notorious gamblers? And I think, for better or worse, that's what Pete is, than now.
Now, how far into this process were you when you found out that Pete would actually talk to you? Because you actually got to talk to him for some of this book.
I was a few months in. I began my reporting by contacting folks who I believed would speak to me and started doing interviews there. And I started really, with people in Cincinnati. I don't live in Cincinnati anymore, but Cincinnati is like one of those little big cities that lots of people know. Everybody in Cincinnati is connected by, 2 or 3 degrees. I know who Pete's friends are in Cincinnati, his pals, his running buddies. I know a lot of people who knew Pete back in the 1960s, when he was basically a youngster. And, I began by, doing interviews with those folks. And, along the way, I was fortunate enough to interview some of his closest friends. And ultimately, one of them made an introduction for me. And so, it was a few months in when I finally, had a chance to talk to Pete Rose himself.
I think we keep saying Cincinnati, and I can't help but thinking, did everyone that you talked to from Cincinnati still swear that Skyline chili is the best chili in the world?
Of course, always. You get banished to the city limits and escorted out of town if you disagree with that, as you know, Brendan.
I do. I've been there. I've had the chili, and I didn't say it was the greatest ever, and I haven't been allowed back. But that's a story for a completely different podcast. Now, Pete's so complicated. Like, I have to think that him as a person and everything you just talked about, it's got to be exciting to talk to him directly because he's just one of the most complicated people, especially in sports. But I mean, as far as people that are famous, he's super complicated. When you started talking to him, is he one of those guys that, he kind of comes off a bit shifty? He's kind of trying to figure out what your angle is? Or was he one of those guys that turns on the charm as soon as you start talking?
I guess step back for a second. I think you're 100% right. No matter how you feel about Pete Rose, whether you like him and you support him, or you dislike him and you don't support him, whether you grew up watching him or whether you've never seen him play baseball, he is objectively one of the most fascinating, complex, controversial athletes of the 20th century. So I agree with that completely, which is really the reason why I wanted to pursue this topic. And, when I met Pete, I wouldn't say that he turned on the charm exactly, but listen, Pete's given thousands of interviews over the course of the last 60 years, maybe tens of thousands. And so for him, this is like a duck in the water. He's completely comfortable. When he called me the first time, and it was he who called me, he was ready to go. And he said, let's go. Let's get started. And we did a lot of talking. When I began the project, going back to something you asked before, I never automatically assumed that he would talk to me, because the fact of the matter is, Pete has never spoken to a journalist, historian, or author who was writing a book about him that he didn't have control over. Frankly, I thought it was pretty long odds that he would talk to me, but he did. And when he called me that first time, we launched right in. And ultimately, I did about a month's worth of phone interviews with him, and then ultimately flew to Las Vegas, where he lives, to meet him in person to continue our interviews there.
I mean, you just have to think, with Pete Rose, of course you're going to meet him in Vegas. Almost like he thumbs his nose at everything. And I mean, it's throughout the book that he's just this type of guy. But I do find it just absolutely hilarious that Vegas is where you're going to meet him.
There is some real cosmic irony there to his chosen hometown late in life. I will say Pete is actually pretty sensitive about that, and he gets upset when people jump to the conclusion that he moved to Vegas just so he could be a degenerate gambler. It is one thing that upsets him, and there are many things, but this is one. And he moved to Vegas maybe because he wanted to gamble. I don't know, but mostly because of his work. He was living in Los Angeles, but had a regular signing gig at casinos there in Vegas, and so was commuting every week from Los Angeles to Las Vegas. And he finally decided, this is silly. My job effectively is here in Vegas. I'm moving here.
So we jump to the end. Let's jump back to the beginning. What I find really interesting early on in this book is the way you set it up, kind of that relationship with his father. And that's something that a lot of kids know, especially for, I was a guy, like, baseball gets passed on very often back in the day from father to son. And now, there's more women in part of this. But back in this day, this would have been something that would have been passed on by Big Pete to Little Pete, right? What was their relationship like?
So there are two schools of thought on this. Pete loves his father. And anyone who's ever read anything that Pete has ever had written for him, or anyone who's ever done an interview with Pete, knows that he still worships his father, Big Pete, who's been dead now for 54 years. But I think, based on my reporting, it's a bit more complicated than that. Pete Rose, the elder, was, based on my research and reporting, one of those original youth sports dads. We see them all the time these days, and they are typically dads who are all in on the success of their son or daughter as an athlete, as a sports hero. And give credit to Big Pete, because he was like that back in 1950. Pete Rose, the elder, believed that his son, young Pete, was going to be great at something. For a while, he thought it would be football. Briefly, he threw his son into a boxing ring, even though Pete Rose Jr. really, really didn't like boxing. And then ultimately, it was baseball. I did interviews, not just with Pete, but with other kids who are now also in their 80s, who were on Pete Rose's youth baseball teams on the west side of Cincinnati, a hard scrabble, prominently white working class German part of town. And these kids told me, now in their 80s, that their own fathers almost never came to the games. This was, again, the 1950s. Their dads were at the factory. Their dads were at their jobs. They couldn't get off and come down to the ballpark at 3:30 or 4 o'clock on a weekday afternoon. But all of them, every single one of them, remembers seeing Big Pete there almost always, right there on the fence line, cheering his son on. And without question, again, whether you take Pete's point of view or you take others' point of view, Big Pete was all in on his son to be a success, and really did instill in his son that he had to hustle. And this idea of hustle wasn't just, because, Big Pete identified this was a way for his son to succeed. It was because Pete was frankly a rather ordinary athlete. He was small. He was never the best player on his own teams throughout his childhood. I'm talking about from the time he played knot-hole baseball in Cincinnati as a 9-year-old to when he left Western Hills High School as an 18-year-old. He was never the best player on his own team. There is really no obvious path for young Pete Rose to find sporting success. And then through a collection of lucky breaks, it just happens.
I mean, lucky breaks, that's exactly what it was. Hearing about how he ended up on these teams that would just fold the next day, that you had to be lucky that it's like, oh, yeah, some guy in a Pennsylvania field has a team over here, you can go over there, and you just hope it doesn't close up by the time you get there. I mean, he was, a lot of times we think about, he's the all-time hits leader, but we forget that this was by not a foregone conclusion that he was ever going to make the big leagues, let alone really the minor leagues.
Correct. And the minor leagues back then aren't even anything close to what we have today. And by that, I mean, Pete started in a rung of baseball that doesn't even exist anymore. In these days, there would be no spot for a player like Pete Rose. He started at the lowest of low in the lowest of leagues. The New York Penn League in Geneva, New York, in June 1960. And he was essentially sent there by the Reds farm director, Phil Segui, to do a favor for Pete's uncle. For all the effort that Big Pete put into making his son a success, it was good old-time nepotism and a connection that Uncle Buddy Blowbaum had with Phil Segui. Pete's Uncle Buddy had, in the 1930s, briefly had some success as a minor league player. And he had landed in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, and played with the Cedar Rapids Bunnies. And again, this is also a rung of baseball that doesn't exist anymore. And it doesn't last long for Uncle Buddy there. After one really good year there, Uncle Buddy injures himself in the very first game of the next season, and it's over, just like that. But on that diamond, he played on the infield next to a light-hitting third baseman named Phil Segui, who would have a long minor league career and then move into management and then move into scouting and ultimately get hired by the Cincinnati Reds as the farm director. And so when Uncle Buddy calls in a favor, essentially, to Phil Segui ships Pete Rose to Geneva. And Geneva wasn't just, the lowest rung of baseball. They barely had a field. It's like something out of Bull Durham for listeners who've watched the movie. I mean, outfielders talked about going back to the wall and scaling the wall to try to make a catch and slicing open their wrists on the top of the wall because the wall was made with corrugated tin or aluminum. I mean, this is what we're talking about in Geneva, New York in June 1960 when Pete shows up there.
I couldn't help but thinking, especially at this part, is we're not going to get into the argument about analytics in baseball. I'm not doing it. But with the way baseball is run now, I just kept thinking, all right, first of all, like we said, Pete wouldn't have even got into any of these leagues because they don't exist anymore. And then he didn't light the world on fire right away either, which means he probably would have been cut right away. He never even sees the big leagues nowadays.
That's correct. And yet, give credit to Pete. He gets that lucky break from Uncle Buddy and that nepotism insider opening that gives him that job in Geneva. And he does struggle. He does struggle for about 6 weeks. But something happens in the second half of that abbreviated season. And it goes back to Pete's work ethic. And this was something that he would carry into the major leagues. He was always better after he saw a pitcher once. And if he was seeing you twice, he was even better the next time. And in the second half of that season in Geneva, his average does turn around. And he ends with a relatively decent average that secures him a spot again in A-ball the following season, this time with the Tampa Tarpons. And when he shows up in Tampa in the spring of 1961, he's a year older, but he's also a lot stronger. He's a lot bigger. He's grown over the winter. And that season in Tampa is when we get the first look, really, of what the future Pete Rose will be. He is truly a dynamo in the Florida State League in 1961 and sort of sets the league on fire.
And so he grows a little bit, he gets to the majors, and that's where we first hear, the name Charlie Hustle, which is really interesting, right? Because as you said, like, hustle, always work hard, running to first base on a walk. But that nickname was actually supposed to be derogatory towards him, wasn't it?
It was. Pete is given that nickname in March 1963 in a game that happened at spring training between the Cincinnati Reds and the New York Yankees. Pete is struggling and fighting and clawing to make the team. He suddenly realizes he's close, and he's trying to supplant the starting second baseman, or at least, catch on as the backup second baseman. That game against the Yankees is a big deal. This is peak New York Yankees, the Mickey Mantle end of the era Yankees. And the game is not just a sellout at Al Lopez Field in Tampa that day. Fans have standing room only tickets, and some are actually scaling the light poles in a scene we can scarcely imagine today to get a view of the field. The game is carried via television back to Ohio and New York. Very rare in those days for a spring training game. It's a huge deal. Pete Rose's dad is in the bleachers as well. And Pete, of course, does what he's known for. He plays his heart out. And one of the things he does, in addition to, breaking up a double play that day and hustling down to first, is at some point in that game, a spring training game, Pete Rose lays down a bunt in an attempt to get on base. And this was sort of the breaking point for Mickey Mantle. He just honestly couldn't understand what he was seeing. And Mickey had played in that game, but was now pulled, and he was standing in the dugout, and he was standing next to another Yankee legend, Whitey Ford, the pitcher. And they were essentially laughing at this kid. And to give readers a sense, or listeners a sense of Mickey Mantle and Whitey Ford, these were men who were physical specimens and true heroes of their day. They had almost sort of been, touched by the hand of God to be good at what they did. They were the opposite of Pete Rose in every way. And so as they're watching him and laughing about how hard he's playing, they come up with a name for him. And in the days after, in the newspapers, there's some dispute about what the first name was. Some reporters say they called him Henry Hustle. Others said they called him the Charlie Hustler. But ultimately, whether the name was uttered in the dugout or given to Pete by the press, they settle that the name that was given to Pete was Charlie Hustle. And you're right, it was intended to be an insult. They thought he was playing too hard. But in a classic Pete Rose pivot, something that he would do many times over the course of his career, he turns this insult in his favor, and he actually embraces it. And that whole summer, his rookie year with the Cincinnati Reds, because he does make the team, he tells the press all over the country and every town he goes to that Mickey Mantle called him Charlie Hustle. Mickey Mantle watched him play and liked what he saw, and the name sticks.
What I find interesting about it is, of course, we would tell any kid playing sports to be like this. And, even though I was born a Yankee fan, so clearly I'm not going to talk about the Mick or Whitey like that. But it also seems like this is kind of a sign of also the fact that Pete does not know how to turn stuff off. that while he's using this and making a positive way, it's kind of also how he's going to end up living his whole life, which is just not knowing when to put on the brakes, not knowing when to, ram into a catcher at an all-star game. Is this kind of where we first start seeing it, or does Pete always have this in his personality since day one?
I think it was in his personality from day one. I think it was instilled in him by his father. And frankly, there was evidence of it even when he was in Geneva. Many people will remember several fights, epic fights, and I mean brawls that Pete would have as a major leaguer. Well, one of the first ones he had was in a meaningless game in Geneva, New York against the Wellsville Braves in the summer of 1960, where he slid so hard into the second baseman who was trying to turn a double play that he infuriated the man and then promptly had a fist fight brawl with the guy at second base. And I think what's notable about that fight in Geneva is that neither man was ejected from the game. Lou Haas, this man who was soon out of baseball, and Pete Rose, who would go on to reach the greatest heights of baseball, both returned to their positions in the next inning. No one was ejected. And that was really what baseball was like back then. It was a much more unpolished sport than we remember or like to believe. It was very rough around the edges. It was very raw. And a lot of these guys were engaging in all kinds of behavior off the field that we simply wouldn't accept today. And that's just how it was in the 1960s.
Even when Pete's not acting like this, though, and you talk about this, he's not necessarily well-liked, though. Like, people might appreciate the hustle, but he seems to rub a lot of people the wrong way. But of course, it's hard. Like, you have somebody like Mickey Mantle who just was born. Like, it was going to happen. People that might take it for granted necessarily. But there seems to be something else about him that he has a harder time getting along with people, even from his first stop, right?
He does. And again, I think this is notable. This was a time when every player, including Mickey Mantle, were playing for their next year's salary. No one was signed to multi-year deals. Many of the top players were so underpaid that they had to take winter jobs selling insurance or cars or working as hosts in prominent hotels. Everybody was playing hard for their next year's salary, for their next year's contract. And so I think it is notable that even in this world where guys are playing hard, many people thought Pete Rose was over the top. They didn't understand why he would drop his bat when he earned a walk and sprint down the first. They didn't understand why he would slide head first into bases. Almost no one did that at that time. And in fact, he was such an outlier that many players thought that he was actually showing them up, and they called him a showboat and they called him a hot dog. And I will say that his personality probably didn't help. Pete always believed, even then in 1963, when he was nobody, that he was going to be somebody, that he was going to prevail, that he was going to make the roster, and that when he did, he was going to succeed. And he didn't mind telling reporters that when he did interviews. And so, all of this, rubbed some people the wrong way.
It also seems like that part of his personality, not being able to get along with his peers, it seems like, especially once he starts making money, because like you said, you don't get paid right away and then you're fighting for every year. But once he starts making money, it seems like he kind of collects hangers-on. And people that aren't necessarily like actual baseball people, somebody that he feels like almost he can control, and like, this guy's loves me because I'm Pete Rose, and this is a good person to have around because they'll do whatever I say. Is that something that happened right away for him? Did he have to get the money first? How did that kind of start for him?
Initially for Pete, it wasn't about having an inner circle of hangers-on. He wasn't big enough for that. But what he did do was hang out with other West Side guys from the West Side of Cincinnati, guys who knew his dad or knew Pete when he was a kid. And a lot of these guys like to go to the racetrack in Cincinnati. And Pete is a fixture there from his earliest days as a Cincinnati Red. And I want to be clear, going to the racetrack is not illegal. It's not against baseball rules. Sometimes Pete was at the racetrack, not just with guys from the West Side, but with local reporters beat writers for the Reds, they would go out there before the games too. But certainly by the 1970s, after Pete has won a couple of batting titles, after Pete has been to a couple of World Series and is bound for more, he starts to build an inner circle around him. And, a lot of these guys are also from the West Side, but they're younger than him, sometimes significantly younger. And they're fans of his. They love him. They're willing to do anything for him, including they're willing to place his bets with bookies. They're willing to place his bets on baseball. They're willing to hide his many girlfriends that he had in these years. And ultimately, they're even willing to lie for him when baseball investigators come sniffing around.
One more question about his relationships. There is a reputation for Pete, depending on who you're talking to, that he was a lot more racially tolerant than most people of this era. In the book, you kind of put that more into context. Would you say that he was more forward-thinking than most people back then, or was that a survival mechanism?
When Pete is a rookie with the Reds in 1963, that showboating, hard hustling attitude and bit of arrogance is off-putting to many of his teammates. So who befriends him in that rookie year? Well, a couple of the black players on the team who are also not welcome in the prominent circles of Cincinnati. And I'm talking about Frank Robinson, future Hall of Famer, and Veda Pinson. These were his earliest friends on the Cincinnati Reds. And I think that stuck with Pete because over the years, he did extend a level of kindness to some of his black teammates when they came up with the Reds and after he was an established star. I'm talking in particular about Ken Griffey, the elder, and George Foster. Both of them have spoken warmly over the years, and George Foster spoke warmly to me about the kindness that Pete Rose showed to them as young black players that they didn't often find from others. But to call Pete forward thinking, I think, is probably the wrong phrase. Pete was hardly a progressive and hardly grasped the complex racial politics of the day, often engaged in the kind of crass humor that simply would not be tolerated today. And he made these jokes, right in front of his black teammates. And yet, they still loved him and still appreciated him. And, I interviewed George Foster. Many people will remember that by the late 1970s, George Foster was one of the most feared home run hitters in the National League. But when Foster joined the Reds in the early 1970s, he was essentially a nobody. The Giants actually traded George Foster to the Reds for almost nothing. They had no idea what he was going to become. And Foster remembered one day in particular. It was after a day game in the early 1970s. The Reds were struggling. Rose was struggling. And Rose asked Sparky Anderson, the manager of the Reds, if he could keep the field for a while. The sun was still up. There was still plenty of daylight. And he wanted to go out and hit baseballs on the field. And it was a day off the next day. And Sparky had a practice plan for the morning. He really didn't want to hold up the grounds crew. But you couldn't stop Pete Rose in moments like these. And so he said, sure. And so Pete Rose goes out there with a coach who throws a few hundred pitches to him. And the grounds crew is all sitting in the dugout waiting for Rose to be done so that they could do their jobs and go home. And while they're doing this, a young George Foster, who has seen no playing time whatsoever, goes out to the outfield to shag baseballs and dump them in buckets and bring them back to the coach so that Pete Rose could keep hitting. And when Rose was done, and the coach's arm was about ready to fall off, Rose offered to Foster that he would pitch to him because, he had been so kind to shag the baseballs. And for the next hour or so, Pete Rose threw batting practice to George Foster, a guy who was barely on the roster. It doesn't seem like a big deal, perhaps. But when I talked to Foster about it, Foster said that no player of Rose's stature and fame and stardom had ever shown him that kind of interest before, much less a white star to a young black player from Alabama.
And I was hoping you were going to tell that anecdote because otherwise I was going to ask for it because, I mean, it just does show that as much as people do want to see him as a villain, he did have these positive aspects and he did do nice things. To contrast it with just how petty he could be, another anecdote, Gene Garber. I'll let you set the stage. There was an episode with Gene Garber and Pete Rose acted like quite literally a child.
The story is from the summer of 1978. Pete seems to be entering the tail end of his career. He has just reached 3,000 hits, a milestone that would seem to ensure his future enshrinement in the Hall of Fame. There's already talk that maybe Pete Rose's career is nearly over. And there's a ton of problems happening with Pete Rose off the field at this time. He is engaging in reckless behavior with women, mistresses, and girlfriends, while his wife is raising 2 kids at home in Cincinnati. He is, by all accounts, gambling more with bookies to the point that sometime in the spring of 1978, Major League Baseball, according to my reporting, sends at least one top-ranking official to Cincinnati to have a secret meeting with Pete Rose and the president of the Cincinnati Reds, Dick Wagner, in Dick Wagner's office to discuss Pete's gambling. So he seems to be flagging as an athlete, aging as an athlete. He's got all these off-field problems. And then in this moment, Pete goes on one of the greatest hot streaks of his career and ultimately puts together a hit streak that exceeds 40 games. This is notable because the all-time hit streak is held by Joe DiMaggio at 56 games. And by the way, in the world of baseball, this is one of the great hallowed records. When you speak about Joe DiMaggio's hit streak record, you have to speak in hushed, whispered tones because it is that important. And here was Pete Rose, this braggadocious, swaggering player coming at Joe DiMaggio's record in the summer of 1978. And he rolls into Atlanta that summer, one of the worst teams in the National League, just a dozen games away. Fulton County Stadium in Atlanta has hardly seen a good game of baseball in its entire existence. And it has barely had any crowds all summer. And a young owner who was also swaggering and braggadocious of the Atlanta Braves, was thrilled that Pete Rose was coming to town. That owner is Ted Turner, the cable news magnate soon to come. Fulton County Stadium is packed. The crowds are over the top, thrilled to see good baseball and see Pete Rose. And on his first game there, Pete extends the streak and extends it to 44 games. And the second game comes, and Pete is so confident that he's going to keep the streak going because the starting pitcher that night is a player who 3 weeks earlier had been in the minor leagues. And Pete has a few good at-bats to start the game, and it's kind of baseball luck that can giveth and taketh away. He nearly has 2 amazing hits, and 2 amazing plays are made on the ball. And so the game inches late into the game, with Pete still hitless and the crowd growing nervous. The game is close. And so the Braves manager, Bobby Cox, brings in his closer, a man named Gene Garber. Garber had started the season with the Philadelphia Phillies, and he was thrilled to be a Philly, A, because the Phillies were his childhood team, and B, because the Phillies were good. The Phillies had been in the playoffs in recent years. They were going back to the playoffs in 1978. Gene Garber was laying down roots in the Philadelphia area, raising children there, and excited to be part of a potential pennant winner. And then he's traded to the lowest of the low, the Atlanta Braves, and he's crushed. So when he comes out to face Pete Rose in the late innings, he's excited because this game is being carried on national television. It's being carried on Ted Turner's network at the time called Channel 17. It's a sold-out house in Fulton County Stadium. And he is able to retire Pete Rose and wants to come back to face him again in the 9th. As it turns out, Pete's going to come up most likely with 2 outs. And so even though by that point the game is out of hand, the Braves have taken a commanding lead, Garber insists on returning to the mound. And Garber retires the first 2 batters, and up comes Pete Rose with the hit streak on the line. Garber wasn't an overpowering pitcher. He threw a lot of curveballs and changeups, soft stuff. It was the pitch he trusted the most. He never actually trusted his fastball. And he falls behind in the count to Pete Rose. And I had a chance to interview Gene Garber over a couple of nights. And Garber told me that when he fell behind in the count to Pete Rose and was in danger of walking him, he was actually shaking on the mound. He was so nervous that he was going to walk Pete Rose, which would be the worst thing to do with a hit streak on the line. He said that he would never live it down. Everybody would talk about how Gene Garber walked Pete Rose, and squandered him of the chance of continuing his assault at DiMaggio's hit streak. So what does he do at that point? He goes to his changeup. And Pete would later complain a lot about the next few pitches. But the fact is, when he was down in the count, 2 balls and 1 strike, Gene Garber throws a hittable pitch, and Pete fouls it off straight back to the screen. He just misses it. And the next pitch is also a changeup, and it's a little outside, and Pete swings and fouls it off. And now he's got 2 strikes. So what does Gene Garber do? He comes back with the changeup, and he throws it again a little outside. If you go back and look at the replay, it is a little outside, but it's the kind of pitch that's too close to let go if you're a batter, because you don't want to go down looking with a hit streak on the line. Pete swings, he misses. Garber celebrates on the mound. He pumps his fists in the air, and the hit streak is over. Pete is so furious that he's cursing and complaining immediately in the post-game interviews. He's frustrated that Garber was trying so hard and complains that Garber was throwing him, quote, bastard pitches, and said that Garber was playing like it was the 7th game of the World Series. And, these comments ring very hollow for the reporters who knew Pete Rose well. Because who always played like it was the 7th game of the World Series? Pete Rose did. And so in the moment where he was denied the chance to continue his hit streak, here he was complaining about another man trying too hard. And of course, the reporters go to Garber's locker and they want him to react to this and they want him to be frustrated. And Garber wasn't. And he said simply, well, of course I was playing like it was the 7th game of the World Series. That's my job. And, when I interviewed Garber, he still maintained that. He said the only thing that frustrates him is that, reporters sometimes call him and they only know the Pete Rose narrative. They suggest that Garber wasn't throwing him strikes, or they suggest that Garber, was throwing him changeup as if that was a bad thing. But to this day, Garber says, I don't regret that Pete complained that I was playing too hard. That was my job.
And it just shows, once again, what we were talking about, his inability to turn it off. He becomes player manager. I think for a lot of people, they think baseball found out about the gambling, and the next day, he's out the door, he's banned from everything when it's over. But Pete actually had a few chances to fix this before he got the lifetime ban, right?
Multiple chances, months of chances. And it begins with the first phone call. Again, for perspective, Major League Baseball was not pursuing this on their own. As I said before, my reporting shows they knew that Pete had gambling problems at least as early as 1978. The reason why Major League Baseball takes an interest in February 1989, just as spring training starts in Florida, is because they hear a rumor that Sports Illustrated, then the Bible of sports, was investigating a tip that Pete wasn't just gambling and he wasn't just betting on sports. He was betting on baseball and he was wagering money on his own team to win. And so the men in New York, Peter Ueberroth, the outgoing commissioner, Bart Giamatti, the incoming commissioner and current president of the National League, and Bart Giamatti's hand-chosen deputy, a man named Fay Vincent, decide to call Pete Rose to New York for a secret meeting. And this meeting was held in a conference room adjacent to Ueberroth's office on Park Avenue in Manhattan. And essentially, after some opening pleasantries, they basically just came right out and asked him and said, "Are you betting on baseball?" Pete denied it. He said no. And it was, according to my reporting, believable. People who were in the room that day actually believed him. They thought, yeah, it would be silly for Pete Rose to bet on baseball, knowing that if he were to do that, he would be breaking a well-known rule of baseball that would ensure his permanent banishment from the game. But based on my reporting, if Rose had come to New York that day and told the truth, everything is different. We now think of Pete Rose for who he is today. A man who's in his 80s and has spent the last 35 years either lying about what he did, minimizing what he did, finally coming to terms with what he did, and then begging for forgiveness and becoming sort of a caricature of himself in the process. But in 1989, Pete Rose was still a hero. This was bad for baseball. And Bart Giamatti, Fay Vincent, and Peter Ueberroth most likely would have done everything they could to find Pete the help he needed. If he would have sat there in the office that day and said, yes, I bet on baseball, and yes, I bet on my own team, I have a problem. But he can't do it. He can't do it then. He can't do it in the months ahead as it becomes clear to him that they have the goods on him, that they don't just have a tip anymore. They have everything. And he still can't do it. And it ultimately destroys him. Again, it's sort of the classic story here. The cover-up is always worse than the crime. And if Pete had been honest at any point in 1989 and admitted what he had done, I do believe that Major League Baseball, starting with Commissioner Bart Giamatti, would have done everything they could to essentially rehabilitate Pete Rose. And I do believe he long ago would have been part of the game again in some way.
Ironically, while Charlie hustled on the field, he was not Charlie hustle to pay his bookies back either, which was another component of that, is that he was so stubborn, wouldn't pay people back, and that also kind of left a trail that was easy for baseball to pick up, right?
Baseball ends up hiring a man named John Dowd to investigate Pete Rose.
Love that name.
There you go. Yes, you do. And, John Dowd was highly overqualified for this investigation. And I mean that in the most respectful way. John Dowd was a prominent Washington, D.C. lawyer, former Justice Department investigator and lawyer who had unraveled lies that had put mobsters and congressmen in court. He would later say, John Dowd would, that the Pete Rose investigation was one of the easiest investigations he ever did. It took him and his team of investigators roughly 6 to 8 weeks to unravel what was at least a decade or at least several years of lies and present these to Pete. And again, when presented with all of the evidence that Dowd had compiled, instead of admitting what he had done, he dug in even further, denying it. I think it just comes back to his personality. That same personality that was insistent upon winning, that always believed he would prevail, that would give no player on the field any edge or any quarter. That same attitude and unwillingness to be vulnerable as a human is really what ends up dooming him off the field.
Now, from my perception, years go on, he's banned from baseball. There still seems to be a lot of groundswell for him to still get into the Hall of Fame. It felt like to me, and this is something that you don't have a ton about in the book, but you do bring it up. A few years ago, it comes out that Pete may or may not have had a relationship with an underage girl. And it seemed like that was the thing that really turned a lot of people off, that a lot of people who were still calling for him in the Hall of Fame, it feels like that was kind of the last straw for a lot of people. Is that just my perception, or did you kind of see that as well?
I think that's true in a lot of ways. Pete did have a relationship in the 1970s with a high school girl in Cincinnati. How old she was when that relationship began is under dispute and likely will always be. But I think ultimately that was, for many people, the last straw for him. But even before that, Brendan, he had applied many times for reinstatement. He had gone on multiple occasions and met with various commissioners of baseball in person to plead his case and still could not win them over. And so I don't know if it would have changed or not, regardless of that other allegation.
All right, Keith, I know this is a hack question. I know it is. I know you're about to get asked this question at least 10,000 times in all the interviews that you're going to do for this book, but it's got to be done. Keith, should Pete Rose be in the Hall of Fame?
So let me be clear. This book looks at Pete Rose through the prism of history, through, granular reporting, tries to tell a story of a complicated figure of the 20th century, and people can make up their own minds about Pete Rose. One thing I was taught as a journalist is show, don't tell. And so this book isn't going to tell anybody how you should feel about Pete Rose, the person, the player, or whether or not he should be in the Hall of Fame. And I want to say, too, that, I'm not here to fight Pete's battles for him. He has made a lot of poor decisions. And I think at this point, he has to live with those decisions, good or bad. To me, the more interesting question is about how we celebrate athletes in this country, period. Are we celebrating them for the lives that they've lived, or are we celebrating them for the art that they have created? This equation, life and art, was one actually that Bart Giamatti, the commissioner of baseball, identified on the very day that Pete was banned in August 1989. One thing that many fans have forgot is that in August 1989, Pete was still eligible for the Hall of Fame even after he was banned. The rules would change 2 years later, about 10 months before Pete's name would appear on the ballot. And so on the day that he is banned, Pete fully believes that one day he'll be elected to the Hall of Fame. And the reporters know that one day they'll have to vote. And so at the press conference at the New York Hilton, Bart Giamatti is asked that very question by a reporter. What are we to do with Pete Rose when he appears on the ballot 2 years from now? Bart that day is a master. He answers questions from the press on national television live for 45 minutes. I mean, just think about that for a second. Imagine any commissioner of any league taking questions from reporters on live national TV for 45 minutes today. It would never happen. Bart does it. And when he's asked this question, he tells the reporter and the whole room of reporters in the whole country that he will do nothing to remove Pete from the ballot. His name will appear there, Bart says, like anyone else's. And he looked forward, he said, to seeing how reporters judged life and art. And, I think that's a very nuanced debate. But historically, I can tell you, when it came to debate about our athletic halls of fame, it was only the art that was looked at for decades. The first Hall of Fame is voted in 1936. Ty Cobb, a man who was no saint off the field and also had his own allegations of gambling, is the highest vote getter in 1936. And for roughly the next 50 years, there is no debate in the press, almost no ink spilled about a player's moral worth as a person. They are debating who they were as a player. It's really only in the 1980s that starts to change, and reporters start to discuss, well, should we let this guy in? He had a cocaine conviction. Should we let this guy in? We know he did cocaine. Should we let this guy in? He wasn't very nice to us. These are real debates that start to happen only in the 1980s. And I think that was because, honestly, Brendan, for those decades, that first 50 years, the Hall of Fame was sort of a small deal. The crowds were small on induction day. Early on, the players gave no speeches whatsoever. When Ted Williams, one of the all-time greats, is inducted into the Hall of Fame in 1966, he gives a speech that he wrote the night before in his hotel for 6 minutes. And today, all of that has changed. If you go to Cooperstown on induction day in the middle of summer, especially when some of the beloved athletes are being inducted, the crowds can exceed 100,000 people. The players give speeches about themselves for more than 30 minutes, praising themselves. And we parade them down the streets of Cooperstown on the back of cars like they're minor gods. I will submit that if being a minor god is the qualification for getting into the Hall of Fame, well, then almost no one meets those qualifications and certainly not someone with as many off-field problems as Pete Rose.
Well, listen, Keith, you just mentioned art, and I just want to point out how artistically you did not answer that question directly. It was, just journalism perfection. Our final question, though, Charlie Hustle, there are people who don't like nonfiction. That's why History Nerds is here. There are people who may not like baseball. If they looked at this book and said, oh, I'm not going to read this, it's a baseball book, there's nothing in this for me, what would you say to one of those people?
Yeah, two things. To me, this is a universal story. This is ultimately a human story of an ordinary man who reached extraordinary heights and then lost it all. And that, frankly, has all the elements of a Greek tragedy. It just happened to play out on an American baseball field. So I think ultimately that's important. And the second thing is, I really think, the backdrop for this is it is a portrait of America at a time when America was changing in ways that I think we've forgotten. So for all those reasons, whether you're a baseball fan or not, whether you ever watched Pete Rose play or not, I think you would find it to be a compelling read.
Keith, I will say, as a rabid Yankee fan, I absolutely loved it. Thank you so much for coming on and talking about it.
Thank you, Brendan, for having me. It was my pleasure.
And that's it for this episode. Keith, thank you so much for coming on. Charlie Hustle, go out and get it, everybody. Even if you're not a baseball fan, you will love this book. Also going to plug any book by Keith O'Brien, one of my favorites. Everything he does is amazing, and he works in a lot of different things. Hit us up Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. Don't forget the YouTube channel. If you haven't checked that out yet, subscribe, please. Love to hear from you. Send us emails, leave us comments. Until next time, nerds, stay cool.
History Nerds United.